I am so looking forward to eating a nice lunch with you and to getting to watch the kids hunt eggs and all of that. I know it's going to be a great afternoon. Appreciate you being here. For those that are going to stick around, for sticking around. But more importantly, even than all of that, I appreciate you being here as we worship God together and as we spend some time thinking about the Word of God that has been given to us. I want to start this morning by just reminding you that we're really concluding our series on Christ in contrast, and we've looked at Jesus' encounters with several different people, several different groups. Now we're looking at Jesus encountering Pontius Pilate, which we'll see in John 18:28 through 19:11 in just a little while. But I want to start by telling you a little bit about a story that was written several decades ago by Flannery O'Connor. I mentioned her in a Wednesday night class not too long ago as well. But it's a story called Wise Blood. I don't know if you've read the book before. Don't necessarily recommend the book to you. It's a very, very dark book, and if you are not knowing what you're getting into, you will be surprised. But she tells a story of a young man named Hazel Motes. And Hazel Motes was the grandson of a fire and brimstone preacher. And he was going to grow up to be a preacher, and he was going to proclaim the righteousness and justification and be saved from the wrath of God, and he was going to set the world on the right track. When he was 18 or so, when he was coming into his own, he was enlisted to fight in World War II. And he went off to war thinking he would be gone for a few months and come back. But he was gone for 4 years and came back. And that's where you kind of meet him in the book. But he's still wearing the clothes of a preacher, but he has come with a very different message. He goes to the big city, if you will, in the story, and he has a message to proclaim to them. He comes to proclaim the church of Christ without Christ, or the church without Christ. He has, in his experience of war, he's seen war, death, and pain, and he has found himself liberated from the nonsensical belief in something beyond this world, certainly not Jesus. And so people need to know the truth. He thought to himself, there's no Jesus, no judgment, no God, and people can just get on with it. He even says that the only truth that matters is that there is no truth. And in the story, it's a very dark story. It's filled with a lot of pain, a lot of violence. But there are two specific lines. They're not even really main lines in the story per se, but they're two lines that stood out to me, especially as it pertains to both our passage for today and our times that we're living in. And the first comes when Hazel Motes goes and buys a car. And he buys an old beat-up Essex, and he's talking to the mechanic who is working on the car because it's got 1,000 problems with it, and everywhere he goes he's got to stop and get some mechanic to look at it. But the mechanic is talking to him about what he's doing, and he's saying, I've come to preach the church without Christ. And the mechanic is, confused by that. What are you talking about? And he says to him, nobody with a good car needs to be justified. And what he means by that is, as you see in the story, is all that matters is that you can go where you want, when you want, how you want, and do what you want. If you have that, it doesn't matter if you're justified or not. All that matters, in essence, is the power to do for yourself what you want to do for yourself. You don't need guidance. You don't need forgiveness. You certainly don't need Jesus. But the other thing which happens toward the beginning of the book, the other line that he says that is so in this fiction book, but is so powerful in thinking about our times, he's lived a life of sin ever since he's come back. He's doing all the things that Jesus would have told him not to do. And so he's talking with one particular woman, and he tells her, I don't have to run from anything because I don't believe in anything. I don't have to run from anything because I don't believe in anything. And if you can get it through your head that there's nothing to believe in, you won't have to run from anything either. In John chapter 18, Jesus is brought to Pilate. And Pilate was the highest governing authority in Judea. He was responsible for the military side of things, political, financial, administrative. Everything came back to Pilate's authority as the prefect or governor of Judea. And he had a reputation for responding violently to those that seemed to be causing him trouble. The Romans in particular, or generally, but Pilate specifically, had a number of run-ins with different religious groups during his period of governorship, where he would, for one thing, he used money from the temple in order to build like an aqueduct, and it caused a huge problem. He paraded the standards of Rome through Jerusalem, which has Caesar on it in a divine way, and of course the Jews believed that to be blasphemous and so forth. There was a number of issues. You see it even in the exchange that they have throughout the Gospels. We're not going to get into it much, but you see that the Jews have come to despise him, and they're always trying to, he and they are always going back and forth trying to one-up each other, even with his sign that he puts up, the King of the Jews, and they're like, hey, don't say that. And he's like, hey, what I've written, Gotcha. But the idea is there's a power struggle there, but it's really Pilate exerting his dominance over the Jews. So, in John chapter 18, verse 28, they show up. They've been interrogating Jesus at Caiaphas' place and everything, but they show up at Pilate's headquarters, dragging Jesus along, leading him along. And what you see in that paragraph is that they are so concerned with their ritual purity that they don't want to enter into Pilate's headquarters because they want to eat the Passover. And of course, readers of John's Gospel are seeing that they are literally slaughtering the true Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, and yet their concern is for the lamb that they will consume, the literal lamb that they will consume at Passover, or that they will slaughter at Passover. Nevertheless, they bring Jesus to Pilate, and in John 18, verse 33, Pilate begins to talk with Jesus. And the question that he wants to know in verse 33 is a simple one: are you the king of the Jews? In other words, Pilate he's asking a political question of Jesus. He's saying, what authority do you claim to have? Who do you think you are, in other words? Where do you rank yourself in relation to everybody else? Are you a king? Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus responds in a perplexing way to Pilate. Perplexing maybe because Pilate has been told by his wife after she had a wild dream, a warning dream in Matthew 27, verse 19. Maybe he's a little uneasy about that, but nevertheless, Jesus responds by saying this, John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world." Maybe what would be most striking about Jesus' statement there is not his claim that it's from another world, but is Jesus' claim that his servants will not fight over his kingdom. For Pilate has only known one way of life and one way of leading, and it is through the accumulation of power and the use of violence to maintain power. And Jesus says, I have a kingdom, but my kingdom is not a kingdom of that kind of power. Pilate is a king, is a governor who has a domain that is protected only through threats of violence and through the use of violence. And so this is a nonsensical statement and outlook on living and ruling. Pilate says to him in verse 37, "So you are a king? Like, what are you saying here? I don't know." And Jesus says this in verse 37, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world." Notice what he says. to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Jesus, in this exchange, provides this contrast between himself and Pilate. He says that Jesus' kingdom is oriented around truth, where Pilate's kingdom is oriented around power. Jesus's is a kingdom of proclamation and persuasion, where Pilate's kingdom is a kingdom of orders and executions. Pilate responds in verse 38, and he says to him, "What is truth?" And that question, of course, in our times is a compelling one, but Pilate is not asking that question because he doesn't believe that 1 + 1 = 2. Right? He understands conceptually what truth is. Pilate is really asking, what does truth have anything to do with your kingdom? With having a kingdom? Power, not truth, is what matters. What is truth? What kind of kingdom is a kingdom sustained by truth? Show me truth and I'll show you my army, right? And we'll see which kingdom is going to come out on top. Truth. Pilate proceeds to show Jesus what power looks like. John 19, Jesus is taken and he's flogged, he's beaten, which would have been severe enough that some men died in the process. By the way, the Jews had the law that said you couldn't be beaten more than 40 times, so they had 39, 40 less 1 lashes. But the Romans did not have that law. So there's really no telling the degree to which Jesus was flogged. Jesus is then paraded around by the soldiers, and they mock him with purple robes and a crown of thorns, hail the man, all of that kind of thing. And Pilate leads Jesus out in front of the people, beaten, bloodied, robe covered, crown of thorns. And he says, "Look at the man, behold him," he shouted. Pilate wasn't wanting to crucify Jesus even still, because Jesus had not done anything that he could really prove was worthy of some kind of execution, anything that could be dangerous to Rome. But the crowd in John 19 starts chanting all the more for his crucifixion, so he goes back to talk to Jesus again. Jesus still sitting there. Pilate comes in and says to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus doesn't respond to the question, "Where are you from?" Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify? Did you not get the message when I had you beaten, bloodied, that I have the power in this relationship?" And Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin," i.e., the one who knew more is guilty of more. But do you notice Pilate's frustration with Jesus here? What will it take for Jesus to see that he is in control here? Like Hazel Motes in Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, Pilate has a good car and needs no justification. He does what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. He has power, and therefore, from his perspective, he has everything he could need. Like Hazel Motes, Pilate doesn't have to run from anything because he doesn't believe in anything. What truth? Who cares? I've got the power. And yet, in our story, we see Pilate on a number of occasions internally wrestling with what is happening with Jesus. It's the point of Wise Blood as well, is Hazel Motes' wrestling internally with his pronounced belief there is no truth, and yet this guilt that he can't get away from. Anyway, Pilate is wrestling with what to do with Jesus because deep down he's afraid. Deep down he is running. He is scared. He's afraid of the crowd's opinion of him. He's afraid of what they might do if he defies their wishes. He's afraid of losing his power. At this time, he was actually already in a bit of hot water with Rome anyway, and so he's trying to figure out how to get out unscathed. His wife's got this dream. And so what does he do? He washes his hands, right? He said, I'm not responsible for this. You're responsible for this. Why? Because he's afraid. He doesn't want to be on the record as being a part of this. He wants them to take the control so that they can take the blame. He says, listen, I don't want anything to do with this because I can't really find anything against him, but you want to kill him, and I can't afford for you to be mad at me and telling Rome, hey, this guy said he was God, or he said he was king, rather, and I didn't do anything about it. So eventually, in verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. And at that point, Pilate had no choice. He delivered him over to be crucified. Then there's Jesus. There's Pilate, the man with all the power who's running scared. And then there's Jesus, the man who presumably had no power. And yet, beaten though he might be, mocked as he was, Pilate comes into him the second time, and he's sitting there in absolute strength. I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that Jesus' second encounter with Pilate is after he's already been beaten bloody. Right? I mean, he's sitting there before Pilate, or standing there before Pilate, as a man who has been externally destroyed. And he is perfectly consistent. He has an integrity that is unwavering, and he acts without any fear whatsoever. He speaks to Pilate as if Pilate is not the highest authority, and tells Pilate that his authority is limited and borrowed and can be revoked. He said, you would have no power unless it had been granted to you. Jesus sits there and does not flinch. The crowd calls out for his crucifixion, and Pilate delivers him over to be crucified. But the person who orients their life around what they can accumulate, whether it be power or whether it be anything else, is always a person running scared. Because the ability to live life will always depend on your ability to keep whatever it is that you can acquire or attain, whether that be power or something else. Jesus, on the other hand, lives a life without fear, because Jesus is living a life that has nothing to do with what he can acquire, and everything to do with the truth that he has come to believe, that he believes, that he knows about God. Jesus is crucified. And in the crucifixion, it appears that truth was weak and power really was strong. Jesus is literally carried off and buried in a tomb. And it's only in the resurrection of Jesus and the subsequent expansion of the followers of Jesus, explosion of followers of Jesus, that it would be revealed that the kingdom of truth actually outlasts the kingdom of power. We live in a world today, as you know, that still worships that idea of Hazel Motz's Essex. We still fall into the illusion, both individually and collectively, that what we need most is to accumulate power for ourselves, for our families, for our group, for our whatever. If we could just acquire enough. Perhaps it's not that far from the truth to say that at times we have tried to live as though if we could just have the church of Christ without Christ, that would be good enough. Right? The truth that it's just, listen, if I can just be rid of that pesky sense of right and wrong, if I could just be rid of that interference from the community and all those kind. If I can just get Jesus out of this, then I could be happy. And yet, like Flannery O'Connor is saying in her book, we can't escape Jesus. He, in a way, sits before us just like he sat before Pilate. And you can interrogate him, you can beat him, you can mock him, but you can't seem to shake him. He sits there grounded, anchored to some reality far beyond our own. And his word to us is not an argument. It's just an invitation. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Whose voice has the most influence in your life? Are you listening to the voice of Jesus, the voice of truth? The voice that can anchor you to the truest reality around which you can orient your life in a way that you don't have to run. Not because you don't believe in anything, but because you believe in the one thing that can't change. Is that your life? Or are you living in the quest for the accumulation of power? Are you living your life in fear of what you might lose? I want to offer you the invitation, if that's the case, that you would come to Christ, that you would be immersed into His kingdom, and that you would live your life in submission to the truth. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. If that's your need this morning, I want to invite you to come as we stand and sing.